Daniel's hand didn't tremble as he reached for Kemi's left hand. But he didn't slide a band on. Instead, he gripped her finger and twisted the engagement diamond off with a brutal, clinical tug that made Kemi's breath hitch in a sharp sob. Before the first tear could fall, he lunged for the microphone on the priest's podium. A piercing screech of feedback tore through the cathedral, forcing the 300 guests to cover their ears. "This was a mistake," Daniel's voice boomed, cold and amplified, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I can't do this, Kemi. You were always just a placeholder for the life I actually wanted." The clink of the ring hitting the marble floor was impossibly loud in the sudden, horrified silence. Kemi stood paralyzed in her white lace, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, while the man she had built her world around executed her dignity in front of everyone they knew. A sea of smartphones rose in unison, the lenses glinting like cold eyes. Whispers rippled through the pews like a spreading fire. But at the very back of the church, near the heavy oak doors, stood a figure who didn't move. Seo Jin-woo. He was a pillar of charcoal-gray wool and jet-black hair, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow down the center aisle. His sharp jawline was set, his expression as calm as a deep ocean, watching Kemi not with pity, but with a terrifyingly focused expectation. Daniel dropped the mic and strode toward the exit, his face a mask of cowardice. Kemi's legs finally moved, fueled by a desperate, illogical panic. She hiked up the voluminous lace of her skirt, her bare feet slapping against the stone as she chased him, her vision blurring with hot, stinging tears. She was inches from the foyer when a hand, firm, warm, and unyielding, closed around her wrist. "Don't," Jin-woo said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a low-frequency authority that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. "Do not chase a ghost." Kemi jerked at her arm, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Let go, I have to fix this. He can't just leave." "He already has," Jin-woo replied, his grip a velvet-covered vice that anchored her against the rising tide of hysteria. "You do not beg a man who just used a microphone to tell the world you were nothing to him. You do not chase a coward. You let him fall." "Who are you?" Kemi hissed, her voice cracking as she looked up into his emotionally controlled face. "Why are you doing this?" Jin-woo didn't answer. He simply released her wrist and stepped past her, turning his fair, composed face toward the stunned congregation. The air in the church shifted instantly. The gossiping whispers died in throats as 300 people felt the sudden, dominant presence of a man who looked like he owned the very ground they sat upon. Kemi's lungs burned as she strained against the man's hold, her white lace sleeves bunching under the pressure of his fingers. Every instinct screamed at her to bolt, to catch the hem of Daniel's disappearing tuxedo jacket before the heavy oak doors swung shut. She didn't care about the 300 pairs of eyes boring into her back or the dozens of blue-lit screens recording her downfall. She only cared about the suffocating void Daniel had left behind, a void she was desperate to fill with his excuses, his apologies, anything but this silence. "Let me go," she gasped, her voice hitting a jagged, hysterical note. "Daniel, wait." But the man in black didn't budge. He was an anchor in a rising storm, his fair, composed face a stark contrast to the blurred chaos of the chapel. He didn't look at the doors. He looked only at her, his dark eyes containing a depth of focus that felt like a physical weight. Slowly, he shifted his body, stepping into her line of sight and forcing her to see him instead of the empty aisle. "Don't," he said, the word vibrating with a low, resonant authority. "You don't understand," Kemi sobbed, her strength finally flagging as the adrenaline began to sour into a bone-deep ache. I have to fix it. My family is here, my whole life." His grip remained firm, but his thumb brushed almost imperceptibly against the pulse point of her wrist, a silent command for her to breathe. He leaned in, his shadow enveloping her, sealing her off from the prying cameras and the judgmental whispers of the pews. When he spoke again, his voice was a cool, steady frequency that cut straight through her panic. "He is not worth your tears, Kemi," Seo Jin-woo said. The sound of her name on his tongue stopped the air in her chest. There was no pity in his tone, only a hard, diamond-like certainty. A man who destroys you in public is a man who was never strong enough to protect you in private. Stop chasing a ghost and start looking at what is standing right in front of you." Kemi's breath hitched, the name Kemi lingering in the air between them like a secret only he was allowed to keep. Before she could find her voice to ask how a stranger knew her name, Jin-woo released her wrist. He didn't turn back toward the door where Daniel had vanished. Instead, he pivoted with a fluid, predatory grace and began to walk toward the altar. The church, previously a hive of buzzing whispers and clicking shutters, fell into a vacuum of silence. The rhythmic tap of Jin-woo's polished Oxfords against the marble was the only sound as he ascended the steps, moving into the space Daniel had desecrated. He stood beside the priest, who looked like a ghost, clutching his Bible as if it were a shield. Jin-woo didn't look at the congregation. He looked directly at Kemi, his sharp jawline set in a line of absolute resolve. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit, drawing out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. With a flick of his wrist, he placed it on the podium. "The license is already prepared," Jin-woo announced. His voice wasn't strained, yet it filled every corner of the vaulted ceiling, commanding the attention of every witness. The groom who stood here was a placeholder. He was a mistake that has now been corrected. Kemi took a trembling step forward, her lace train rustling like dry leaves. "What are you doing?" she whispered, the words lost to the crowd but caught by him. Jin-woo extended his hand toward her, palm upward, a silent, immovable invitation. "I am giving this ceremony the dignity it deserves," he said, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a heat that burned through her shock. "I will not let you walk out of here as a victim of a coward's whim. I will marry her," he declared, turning his gaze finally to the stunned 300 guests. "I will take the place he was never man enough to hold." The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel didn't just open. They slammed against the stone walls with a violence that made the floral arrangements tremble. Daniel was back. His face was no longer a mask of cold indifference. It was a contorted mess of crimson rage and wounded ego. He marched down the aisle, his shoes skidding on the marble as he pointed a shaking finger at the man, standing where he had stood only moments before. "Get away from her," Daniel's voice cracked, echoing off the vaulted ceiling in a frantic, undignified screech. "Who do you think you are? This is my wedding. You can't just walk in here and take what's mine." Kemi felt the air leave her lungs, her fingers twitching against the silk of her skirt. The panic began to rise again, a familiar, drowning sensation, until she looked at Jin-woo. He didn't flinch. He didn't even shift his weight. Jin-woo simply turned his head, his sharp jawline cutting a silhouette of absolute, terrifying calm against the altar's light. His composed expression didn't break into anger. It settled into something far more dangerous. He took one step down from the dais, positioning his broad-shouldered frame directly between Kemi and the approaching storm. The air in the church seemed to drop 10 degrees. As Daniel reached the front pews, he suddenly skidded to a halt. He wasn't stopped by a physical barrier, but by the sheer, predatory stillness in Jin-woo's gaze. Jin-woo said nothing, yet his silence carried the weight of a death sentence. It was the look of a man who didn't play by the rules of polite society, a man who saw Daniel not as a rival, but as an insect to be crushed. "One more step," Jin-woo said, his voice a low, melodic threat that barely carried past the first row, "and you will learn exactly why she was never yours to begin with." Daniel's mouth opened, then shut. The bravado drained from his face, replaced by a primal, stuttering fear. He looked at Kemi, then at the iron-willed stranger shielding her, and realized he was no longer the protagonist of this story. He was an intruder in a kingdom he didn't understand. Under the silent, lethal weight of Jin-woo's stare, the groom who had arrived to humiliate finally turned and fled for the last time. The sanctuary was pinned under a suffocating stillness as the echoes of Daniel's retreating footsteps faded. Jin-woo didn't watch him go. He turned back to the altar, his movements as precise and intentional as a blade sliding into a sheath. The priest was trembling now, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the pulpit, his eyes darting between Kemi's tear-stained face and the dark, navy-clad stranger who had just cleared the room with a single look. This is highly irregular," the priest stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "There are protocols. Canon law, civil requirements. I cannot simply marry two people who walked into this building as strangers. Jin-woo reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal jacket and withdrew a second, slender document. He didn't toss it. He placed it firmly on the open Bible, his long fingers pinning the page. The protocols have been satisfied, Jin-woo said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that brooked no dissent. The license is valid. The background checks are complete. The state has already recognized this union. All that remains is for you to recognize it before God. The priest adjusted his glasses, leaning in to read the document. His eyes widened, scanning the official seals and the signatures that shouldn't have existed. He looked up at Jin-woo, not with clerical authority, but with a primal, sudden realization. This wasn't just a romantic gesture or a wealthy man's whim. This was an ambush planned with the surgical precision of a man who moved mountains before breakfast. The priest's gaze flickered to the shadows at the back of the church, where two men in identical dark suits stood like statues. He understood then. The law of the land was a suggestion to a man like Seo Jin-woo. I see, the priest whispered, his resistance crumbling under the sheer weight of Jin-woo's presence. He looked at Kemi, his eyes pleading for a sign. Shall we proceed? Kemi felt the heavy silence of the cathedral pressing against her eardrums, a vacuum that only Jin-woo seemed capable of filling. When he reached out and took her hand, his palm was warm and calloused, a grounded reality in a world that had turned to smoke. The priest's voice began to rise again, though it lacked its earlier ceremonial pomp. It was now a hurried, rhythmic chant, as if he were trying to outrun the ghost of the man who had just fled. Do you, Seo Jin-woo, take Kemi Adebjo to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, Jin-woo said. The words weren't spoken, they were issued. There was no tremor of doubt, no flicker of the placeholder uncertainty that had always haunted Daniel's promises. He looked at Kemi with an intensity that made her knees feel like water, his dark eyes locking onto hers as if he were physically pulling her back from the edge of a cliff. Then the priest turned to her, his gaze darting to the black-clad men in the shadows before landing on her tear-streaked face. And do you, Kemi, take this man? Kemi looked back at the pews, at the hundreds of blurred faces, and the glinting lenses of phones that would soon broadcast her shame to the world. She thought of Daniel's retreating back, and then she looked at the man standing before her, a man who had turned a massacre into a coronation. A surge of cold, sharp spite flared in her chest, followed by a magnetic, terrifying pull toward the stranger holding her hand. He was a dangerous exit from a burning building, and she was ready to leap. I do, she whispered, her voice gaining a sudden, crystalline strength. The air in the church shifted, thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of something unspoken. As the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Jin-woo didn't wait for the cue. He leaned in, his charcoal suit brushing against her white lace, and pressed a brief, possessive kiss to her forehead. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a seal. You are mine now, his silence seemed to say, and I do not lose what is mine. The echo of the priest's final blessing had barely settled before Jin-woo turned, his hand sliding firmly into the small of Kemi's back. He didn't wait for the organist to begin the recessional. He simply moved, and Kemi found herself walking beside him, her white lace train sweeping over the marble floor like a retreating tide. As they reached the first row of pews, the atmosphere in the church underwent a visceral transformation. The shocked murmurs that had been simmering throughout the ceremony died instantly. The 300 guests, friends, family, and the curious socialites who had come to witness a tragedy didn't just step back, they recoiled. There was a magnetic, dangerous repulsion radiating from Jin-woo that made the crowd part with a synchronized, silent urgency, like the Red Sea yielding to a king who didn't need to ask for permission. Kemi kept her eyes forward, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could feel the heat of the camera flashes on her skin. The voyeuristic glint of hundreds of lenses trying to capture the face of the man who had just claimed her. But Jin-woo was an iron shield. He didn't look left or right. His sharp jawline remained set, his gaze fixed on the heavy oak doors at the end of the aisle. The men in the back, the statuesque figures in dark suits, stepped forward in a seamless maneuver, flanking the new couple. The physical space they occupied seemed to expand, pushing the crowd further into the shadows of the nave. By the time they reached the threshold, the silence in the church was absolute, a vacuum created by the sheer dominant weight of Jin-woo's presence. He pushed the doors open, and the afternoon sun flooded the foyer, blinding and bright. Kemi took a final breath of the incense-heavy air and stepped out onto the concrete, leaving the wreckage of her old life behind for a future she could no longer see. The transition from the blinding sunlight of the church steps to the interior of the sleek black sedan was nearly silent. Within minutes, the vehicle was gliding toward the city's skyline, the tires humming a low, predatory tune against the asphalt. Jin-woo sat beside Kemi, his posture as composed as a statue, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't offer comforting words, yet his presence was a physical weight that seemed to press the air out of the car's cabin. They arrived at a monolith of glass and steel that towered over the city like a silent sentry. The driver, a man with the same disciplined stillness as the guards at the church, opened the door. Jin-woo offered his hand, and Kemi took it, her fingers still trembling against his warm, calloused palm. They were whisked into a private elevator where Jin-woo didn't press a button. Instead, he stepped toward a biometric scanner. A thin red line of light swept over his iris, followed by a soft, melodic chime that signaled the car's ascent. When the doors slid open, Kemi gasped. The penthouse didn't feel like a home. It felt like a fortress masquerading as a gallery. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the world they had just escaped, but the glass looked reinforced, thick enough to stop a bullet. In the center of the sprawling marble foyer stood an older woman with her hair pulled back into a bun, so tight it seemed to sharpen her features. Behind her, two younger men stood near a bank of monitors that flickered with live feeds of every corridor and entrance. "This is Mrs. Kong," Jin-woo said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, modern space. "She will ensure you have everything you need. You are safe here, Kemi. The world outside can no longer reach you without my permission." Mrs. Kong stepped forward, her expression unreadable but her bow deep and respectful. Kemi looked back at the elevator, then at the high-tech security grid humming in the corner. She had escaped the humiliation of the altar, but as she looked at Jin-woo, she realized the gates had closed behind her. She wasn't just his wife, she was a resident of his stronghold. The silence of the penthouse was clinical, broken only by the low hum of the climate control and the distant, muffled pulse of the city below. Kemi stood in the center of the vast living area, her lace train a stark, white ghost against the dark hardwood floor. She turned to Jin-woo, who had moved to a minimalist bar, pouring a single amber liquid into a crystal glass. "Why?" she whispered, the question finally tearing through the shock that had muffled her voice all afternoon. "You didn't just happen to be at that church with a marriage license in your pocket, Jin-woo. No one is that prepared for a coincidence." Jin-woo didn't turn around immediately. He swirled the glass, the ice clinking with a rhythmic, sharp sound that reminded her of the ring hitting the marble. "I don't believe in coincidences," he said, his voice a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "I believe in leverage." He finally turned, his composed expression illuminated by the twilight glow filtering through the reinforced glass. "I have been watching Daniel Akoy for 6 months. I knew about the offshore accounts he was draining to pay off his gambling debts. I knew about the woman he was planning to fly to Paris tonight with the money your father invested in your future together." Kemi felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been struck. "My father, you've been tracking my family." "I've been protecting an investment," Jin-woo corrected, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Your father's company sits on land my syndicate has been eyeing for a decade. Daniel was a parasite, Kemi. He was going to bleed your family dry and leave you in the dirt. I simply moved the timeline up. I didn't just save you from humiliation. I bought your father's debt before Daniel could sell it to my rivals." He walked toward her, his shadow stretching across the floor until it touched the hem of her dress. "You think I stepped in because I'm a hero. I stepped in because I don't let property I intend to own be destroyed by an amateur." Kemi recoiled as the truth hit her, a cold, jagged realization that she hadn't been rescued so much as she had been reacquired. The man standing before her wasn't just a husband. He was a silent partner in her father's ruin, a predator who had waited for the perfect moment of vulnerability to move in. "Property," she whispered, the word tasting like copper in her mouth. You married me to secure a land deal. Jin-woo set his glass down on the obsidian countertop with a sharp, final click. He stepped into her personal space, his hand reaching out to tilt her chin upward. His touch was light, almost reverent, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. I married you because a woman like you should never have been a pawn for a man like Daniel. Under my name, you are untouchable. Your father's debts are gone, and your reputation is no longer a punchline on a social media feed. You are the wife of Seo Jin-woo. That makes you a queen in a world where most people are merely prey. As if to punctuate his words, a soft chime echoed from the wall-mounted monitors. Mrs. Kong stepped forward, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Sir, the courier from the docks has arrived. There was an issue with the shipment. 3 men are in the holding room. Jin-woo didn't blink. His expression remained flawlessly composed, but the air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden, lethal electricity. He looked back at Kemi, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw one last time. Rest now, Kemi. Mrs. Kong will show you to your quarters. You are safe here, but you must understand that my world has rules. Do not go looking behind closed doors. He turned and walked toward a concealed panel in the wall that slid open to reveal a dimly lit corridor. As he vanished into the shadows, Kemi caught a glimpse of the 2 suited men from the church waiting for him. Their holsters visible beneath their jackets. The door hissed shut, leaving her alone in the silent, glass-walled fortress. She was safe from Daniel, safe from the world's laughter, but as she stared at her reflection in the darkened window, she realized she had traded a cage of straw for one of reinforced steel and blood.